Hi, thanks very much. A really interesting discussion, and you've taken it to like a really high level. I wanted to ask just, Gilles, if you had done any, if you'd looked into the issue of corruption in your book, because I think this is like there's such an omerta in our system on the issue of corruption, and it's a massive issue, especially when you're looking at war economies, when you're working in places, northern Syria, Yemen. I mean, the black market there is basically where, it's all happening. So I'd just be interested in your reflections on that.
Thank you. Any other questions here in London? Yes, we've got a question. Take a question here and then a question there.
I'm Paul Currian. I work as an independent consultant for humanitarian organisations. You don't have to subscribe purely to the idea that cost-benefit analysis rules the world to think that one of the fundamental problems we've got is that it is against the interests of the actors that hold the power within the system to make changes to that system. And I wonder then, in light of that, whether we aren't stuck in what I think David believes of basically a death spiral of the humanitarian community as the norms gradually go up in flames because of that conflict of interest. And I wondered whether any of the panel participants saw a way out of that.
Thank you very much. We have one question here, and then I'll have the panel answer.
Yes, hi, Ben Beccari from the Institute for Advanced Studies in Pavia, Italy. I'm a PhD researcher there. I'm interested in sort of the question of moral hazard presented by the international humanitarian community and for recipient countries that, that also acts as a impediment to change, to reduce the occurrence and impact of crises before they happen, because then we don't get to come in and save the day afterwards. So I'd be interested in your reflections on moral hazard as well.
Thank you. Great. I think I'll let our panelists take any of those questions. I'll begin with Gilles because I believe the first question on corruption from MSF was addressed to you. Go ahead, but then feel free to answer any other questions.
Yes, corruption, great question and great word. I think indeed it's important to address corruption head on and to name a cat, and corruption. And it's highly detrimental not only because of leakages and problem accruing because of corruption, but it's very detrimental from what I see to institutionally to the relationship and trust between headquarters, head of operations in the capital cities, in conflict countries or countries where you had a disaster, and field offices. And it's detrimental because it's not thematized, it's not discussed openly on the table, and it's not. We do not engage. We do not engage corruption with a lot of staff who face daily habits, pressure, starting with protection racket and moving all the way down to the fact that if you want to run your operation, you have to enter into a lot of deals. And these result often in strange accounts reported back from the field to the head office and then to the headquarters, which breed distrust. And this has been very detrimental so far. And I am personally disappointed that the Grand Bargain and Istanbul did not focus on corruption head on. And there are now more and more research being done on what to do out of it, how to engage constructively corruption head on. And I deal a bit with it under different guises in my book, but I think we should really move on. And last week, I had a week of training for an executive program at the Center for Education and Research on Humanitarian Action, and we had half a day on corruption with our, with staff, which basically come from the Middle East, Africa, and elsewhere, because I think it's a key topic. So yes, but much to do. Maybe on the question of moral hazard, It's an excellent point. In my chapter on disaster economics, I deal a lot with moral hazards, and I refer to an example of a mayor of Fudai, who, he was a mayor in the 60s, 70s, the 80s of I don't know Fudai, but I guess a small town close to Fukushima. And he raised taxes and invested to build a dike which was very, very high, and so high that it's one of the few communities that has been protected. But he was dead by the time the tsunami occurred, and he's kind of a posthumous hero in a sense. But the community has to pay for that for ages, and once you have the disaster, that community should not receive aid because basically they were protected, whereas all the others do receive the aid. So as a political leader, as a mayor, if you are rational in the economic sense, which is a specific case of rationality, which is consequentialist and not morally tainted, I would say, then it's irrational to invest because of moral hazards. And one of the tension between the aid industry and the insurance industry is that the insurance industry wants to promote certain products in middle-income countries which are prone to disasters. But of course, as long as those states can be rather sure to get generous aid from the humanitarian system, relief system, for free, it's a question whether they should pay, for instance, interest on cat bonds rather than wait for aid to come from abroad. And one argument might be the argument of national sovereignty, to say I don't want to depend anymore from foreign aid. I prefer to invest in prevention and disaster risk management in order to be sovereign in dealing with the risk. So it's a very interesting topic, and my sense is that because of the interest of the financial markets and the insurance industry, the political economy obstacles are being reduced substantially. And I think we can discuss maybe of the third question later on, but I would leave it also to other panelists.
Sure, thank you. Maybe I could turn to David at this point. Please feel free to answer any questions, but there was perhaps a specific question to you and others on, the resistance to change by the powers that be, because they don't have any interests in change or in promoting the norms and ideals that we are trying to espouse as a sector. And what can be done about that?
Well, I mean, absent the total transformation of society, absolutely nothing. I mean, this conversation is taking place in Never Never Land. I mean, take the Security Council. The Security Council determines a lot of the broad architecture, I think we would all agree on that, of the global system. One of the 5 veto-wielding members is now fighting a war in which it's as if the Geneva Conventions didn't exist. So where, the humanitarian system is going to rise on its hind legs and, preach the gospel to people who have wars to win and wars they've chosen to win by any means necessary. I just don't know where this conversation is taking place. I'm sorry. I'll answer one other question, which is I get very nervous when I hear about moral hazard, because I'm very old now, I'm 64 years old, and I've seen a very long period in which moral hazard has been a way for the global north to bash the global south and moralize that bashing. So I guess when I hear, moral hazard, I'm not an economist, obviously, I'm not using it in a technical sense. I get very nervous.
Thank you. But just maybe on the second part of the question, is there really nothing that can be done? Maybe taking a more, cost-benefit analysis or a more realistic approach to what can be done about our application of our norms and principles in the face of very little moral authority or very little willingness on the other side to pay attention to it. And then I'll turn to you, Sarah. David, is there any ideas you have?
Sorry. Look, I think the old debate within MSF France, about whether, humanitarian aid, as I said in my opening little tantrum, was is humanitarian action, a limited thing that can be done worse or better, but isn't going to change the world? Or is it a methodology through which the world can be changed in a drastic way? If it's the former, I think that's perfectly coherent. If it's the latter, I think it's pure wishful thinking.
Sarah, you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I have to agree with David on that. I was, surprised, perturbed by the direction that the World Humanitarian Summit took. And it became a declaration of intent for humanity. It looked a bit like a Miss World contest speech or something in many respects. I think there was I read somewhere that a UN delegate quipped that Michael Jackson could have written some of the Secretary General's comments, because the fact is that for the humanitarian sector, its power, and maybe just to backtrack a little bit, Gilles' contribution is very much about how does economics play out in humanitarian action and in the context that humanitarian actors are operating in. I would say, and I'm sure, and it's also reflected in your work, that needs to be complemented with a close analysis of how does power play out. And there are lots of different aspects to that question. So within the humanitarian sector, or what we recognize or see as being the humanitarian sector, that's arguable as well. There are all sorts of asymmetries of power that play out within the sector, and at the very bottom of the heap, if you like, are local responders and beneficiaries. And there are lots of ways that power plays out from top to bottom within the sector. The sector does exert power in many ways. It carries out key governance tasks, if you like, in many of the contexts that it's present and engaged in, and is a very powerful actor at the local level in many respects. But where the humanitarian sector doesn't have power is on the international political and security stage, and therefore there are a lot of other interests and actors who exert huge power over the sector, sometimes through the donors that the sector depends on, sometimes in the lack of access that humanitarian agencies have to areas where they would wish to operate. That plays out. So that kind of really dynamic power play within and beyond the sector needs to be understood. And anyone who wants to actually challenge the status quo for sort of progressive reform of the sector really they don't need to be political, but they need to understand the politics and understand the many ways that it plays out. I wrote a list earlier of the different types of power that operate from top to bottom through the sector. You have network power, cultural power, bureaucratic power, symbolic power, financial power, consumer power when it comes to the donors buying humanitarian services, the governmental power sort of playing out in a sort of form of paternalism. Michael Barnett has called it what does he call it? Therapeutic domination on the ground. But there are lots and lots of power dynamics, and anyone who wants to challenge the status quo almost needs to play that game and understand those different dynamics. And there are some areas there where power can be influenced. Other actors can actually. So for a sort of progressive agenda, there is, in this day and age, a lot that can be done with network power. The system is not fixed. It's very fluid. Sometimes it's hard to understand who it is and what it is that we're trying to describe and trying to understand. So that fluidity can be quite useful.
Dagan, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. I wanted to know if you had any reactions to any of the answers that the other panelists have given, but also if you wanted to answer any of these questions yourself. We had one on corruption, one on resistance to change and norms in flames, one on moral hazard, and this discussion that Sarah has just had on power and the different aspects of power and challenging those. What would it take?
So when the World Humanitarian Summit process started, many of us, I think, particularly from the Global South, were very optimistic, thinking that finally we would have an opportunity to have a process where we would be heard and our issues and our concerns around exactly what we're talking about, the issues of politics and power and the whole architecture, the reforming the architecture, were the things that we were going to actually get to the root of, get to the bottom of. And unfortunately, every single time we brought up these concerns in the regional consultations around UN Security Council reform and how that needs to be one of the biggest issues coming out of the whole WHS process. When we brought up issues around counterterrorism legislation and how it's impacting aid and directly leading to problems in terms of delivery. And, one of the problems and biggest contributors to the famine was this issue of counterterrorism legislation, the famine in Somalia. So, whenever we try to bring up these very really critical issues, we would have they would never be seen. They would never see the light of day outside of the little room we were discussing, and they would never be put to the pen to paper. So that, I think, has been one of the biggest disappointments of the whole process. And going back to this issue of power, I think, yes, I'm not trying to be naive by far. I've been in this business for a long, long time now. But at the same time, I just do think that I really do believe in the power of civil society and people. And we've seen major disruptions to power, irrespective of the reasons and the root causes, whether it's the Arab Spring, whether it's Brexit, and now Trump in the U.S. We might not agree with every single one of them, but there has been that angst and that disruption of power that has occurred. And I just feel that it's very difficult to do that if our more resourced, more influential, more and critical actors in terms of volume of response and more needed by the donors, INGOs, are not going to actually participate in this conversation, and not just participate, but actively engage in transforming the system and be proper allies, in real solidarity, where they're willing to make economic sacrifices. Are you willing to lose the funding of your donor by actually coming on the streets with us, with the Global South NGOs? That's the problem. I think people are just too comfortable earning their nice salaries, turning out more proposals, turning out great reports for the donor. As Sarah said, they're the clients, it's not the communities. And so I don't think people want to take those kinds of risks and actually participate and engage in agitating for change. And so therefore, we're kind of in the South left on our own, and we have to go into this mammoth, almost insurmountable battle on our own and try to gain solidarity amongst ourselves in the South and work with our national governments, that we have no choice. But I mean, look at the Syrian NGOs, what they did. They basically said we cannot be complicit in this UN biased system working with war criminals such as the Assad government, and we won't take any money from you. They boycotted. Now, show me any INGO that's willing to take that risk and actually make that brave decision. No, they're not. So on top of the fact that we've had major allegations of fraud and corruption, I will be very surprised if we see any INGOs shutting down. And this leads to my response on that issue of corruption. I think that, there is a very, very biased, automatic knee-jerk reaction whenever you talk about putting more resources into the hands of local communities and local actors. Automatically corruption comes out, as if somehow the only corruption that could exist is only in the South. And people in the North are not complicit, INGOs are not complicit or not part of the problem. Some of just the volume and the size of the funding and the resources that goes into the hands of INGOs and the UN agencies, the risk is actually higher in terms of corruption with them. Local NGO that only gets $200,000-$300,000 projects as opposed to an INGO or UN agency that gets 20 million from one donor in 1 year in Syria. Who's the bigger elephant? Who's gonna be more risk? Where's the risk higher? But it's this idea and this perception that they're impervious to corruption, and it's only those in the South that have these problems. So I think a lot of it is just attitudes and just biases and prejudices, frankly. This conversation around corruption and risk, we really, really, really have to start having very frank conversations about why do we automatically assume that all the risk lies in the hands of local NGOs. I'm not saying there is no risk. I'm not saying there is no corruption in the hands of local NGOs. I'm not saying at all. But at the same time, when we have problems, Somalia is a great example. When we have a problem with a local NGO and there's an incident of fraud, nobody ever says, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. This is an organization that has been in existence for 20 years. Maybe this is one individual who had this incident. It's not maybe an institution-wide issue. We can't throw away an investment of 20 years by the international community, INGOs and UN have supported this local NGO. Automatically, this NGO is blacklisted. Simultaneously, fraud incidences happen with an INGO or UN agency, and it's not even a blip. There's nothing that happens. There's no stopping of funding. Actually, the donors themselves are complicit in hiding it and covering it up so that the taxpayers, it doesn't come out in the newspapers and the taxpayers don't learn about it. And so there's this huge collusion that goes on between donors and their national organizations in the global north. And so I'm sorry, but we have to really be honest and call a spade on these issues.
Okay, thanks very much, Dagan. So my iPad doesn't seem to be registering questions from the online audience. Yeah, they're not coming in, right? Is there any one final question that we can answer in the room before I close? Yes, go ahead. And wait for the microphone, please.
I'm Ula Bago. I'm development.
Sorry, can you just wait? Can we have a microphone, please?
Thank you. Ula Bago, I'm a development economist and only sort of the fringes of humanitarian action, but I'm a global citizen and I'm speaking as one like that now. So humanitarian action should be differentiated, I guess, in natural disasters and armed conflict, and we've been mainly looking at armed conflict here. I've been told that the number of people killed in armed conflict has never been lower since the Middle Ages, just to put this into context. So actually putting the humanitarian sector into the wider context of armed conflict. And military strategy, I'm also informed that that is to ensure that the will to live for your enemy is taken away. So how does humanitarian action fit into this? Because, well, it could prolong the action, if you like. So military strategy should also feature as the whole context in which humanitarian action takes place.
Okay, why don't I...
Yeah, why don't we stop there?
Yeah, we'll stop there. And maybe I could address this question to Gilles, who can have the last word of the session. How does humanitarian action fit into military strategy, given the dynamics of the current ways in which war is waged?
Okay, so I try to address this head on. I just want to say two words on the discussion which we had. One about the P5 and the Security Council. Indeed, we have 4 of the P5 engaged militarily in several of today's largest crises. And those 4 P5, permanent member of the Security Council, were represented at a very low level and did not show much interest at the World Humanitarian Summit. And those countries that sent higher representatives were other countries which are not directly. And this is, this just shows the interest and appetite top-level officials from the permanent members of the Security Council to attend and participate in the World Humanitarian Council, and it says a lot. And the other question about corruption, I cannot agree more with Degan. I think what I was mentioning and the few studies that I did, research that I did, was on corruption within international organizations and international NGOs. I've not conducted any research on corruption on southern NGOs, so I don't know. And indeed, the big question here is that donors and the ministers of aid in large donor countries in the West say, on the one hand, as agencies, we must work in very difficult conditions, so we are risk takers. We have a high appetite for risk. But the next sentence, they say we have zero tolerance for corruption. So, I don't know how, if I would be a manager of operations, I would actually deal with this call for being, taking risks to do work that has to be done, but have zero tolerance for whatever. That said, let me come to the question here. When looking at the humanitarian aid boom in terms of funding that we had for international humanitarian over the past 25 years, you're right, most proxy indicators for needs, when you look at the main centers who study both the number and the intensity of armed conflicts, have tended to show that, especially during the 1990s, you have a big drop in the number and intensity of armed conflicts, except Rwanda with the genocide, which is another question. And then some stagnation. It's only over the past few years, in 2012, 2013, that you have kind of a reversal of the curve. If you look at other indicators like the number of refugees, except Palestinian refugees, it has been also declining in the 1990s, while the humanitarian market was booming. Finally, the number of disasters caused by natural hazard has been increasing as they are registered until 2002, 2003, but you don't have a clear pattern of trend with regard to the number of people dying because of a disaster or made homeless or injured. So you would say, at one hand, this boom in the humanitarian market is driven by demand from donors who, for lack of will or resolve to resolve chronic crisis, by default, fund more humanitarian action is one option. The other factor, which is more rejoicing, is that you have a multiplication not only of humanitarian actors, but also of the diversity of services. When I started as a humanitarian worker 20 or 30 years ago, almost, we had no program for mental health support. We had no program on gender-based violence. We had no program for unaccompanied children, etc. So today we have become more sophisticated. We moved from dealing with infectious disease to dealing with chronic disease. It's more costly. And this explains from the supply side the increase in the overall level of the market. So I think that this is quite important to be considered. But indeed, when we have classes with students coming, the first question is, why is the humanitarian booming? Most of our students tend to say, it's because there are more crises, there are more war, there are more conflict, and the data does not show exactly that, and it's important to put this in perspective.
Thank you, Gilles. And thanks to everybody here in the audience and online who participated in this. Thanks to our panelists, both here in London and from the far-flung reaches of the globe, for engaging in this discussion. I mean, just briefly, what I've taken away from this is that our system is inherently political, that humanitarian action in and of itself is supposed to be neutral and not engaging in politics directly, but it is political as a system, and it has political drivers and political implications, and we need to better understand this in our work. That cost-benefit analysis, economic analysis, can be helpful when analyzing the nexus between interests and actions. That principles perhaps are unconvincing today in a world that is unjust and with countries that are dismissive of them. But in the face of state inaction and indifference, can we use the power of civil society to counterbalance some of that indifference? But within that, we have to be more honest about our evidence and our conversations around civil society engagement, specifically about risk and corruption and how it is unevenly applied. But that at the fundamental basis of this, and I think this is what you're trying to say in the book, Gilles, but correct me if I'm wrong, that political economy analysis is something that we don't do but should. It's not in our DNA. We have sort of an allergy to it when we make decisions or we strategize about our operations, but it needs to be involved in our policy making, in our decision making, in our operations to help inform the trade-offs that we interact with and that we face every day on the ground. Anyway, thanks very much. There are refreshments outside. Please feel free to indulge in them. There's also some books for sale, I believe, of the Humanitarian Economics book. The recording of this will be online in a few days' time. And that's it. Thank you very much for everybody for your participation. Take care.